Hey guys, it's Alex and Dad from 7th Hour Films, back again with Doctor Who Classic. Last time on Doctor Who Classic, we listened to the 2015 audio Damaged Goods. What all happened last time, Dad?
Oh boy. I was not a fan of Damaged Goods. In my opinion, too much going on. Again, giant squids and twins with psychic something.
Vampires.
Vampires.
Yeah.
Which only came in at the very last minute. Anyway, not one of my favorites.
Yeah. But this time around, we are moving on to the Chimes of Midnight with the 8th Doctor, which is interesting because the only thing we've seen of the 8th Doctor is the movie. So,
which I kind of liked.
Yeah, I did like that too.
And I do want to say right here at the beginning, I'm very sorry that if you've seen the last episode, right at the end, I was speculating that this was somehow based on the Orson Welles Chimes at Midnight, which I remembered incorrectly was something about Macbeth. It was actually about King Henry IV and Falstaff and Henry V. And I'm somewhat disappointed it wasn't something like that. I mean, the idea of Doctor Who literally plopping down into the middle of a Shakespearean tragedy or history would have been, I think, kind of cool. This one, very interesting in a kind of odd sort of way.
Yeah, definitely. So, then we can go ahead and get right into our notes. I did like this one.
The only thing that I really... It's not even really a criticism, is just that it's so much like Holy Terror in the format, in that they land inside of something that isn't real.
That's true.
And I don't know, it just seemed like, I don't want to say a ripoff or anything like that, but it was so similar to that it kind of, for me anyway, took away from the overall enjoyment of it. I really enjoyed the Victorian stuff and a lot of the upstairs, downstairs sort of stuff.
Right.
Very, very fast-paced, a lot of subtle humor in it. But that, at the end when it came out that it was really just, the house replaying itself, I thought that was... And I didn't care for it.
To be fair, with the Holy Terror, it's like, well, they ended up inside of this prison for this guy, and it kept replaying the story, but you didn't realize it was replaying it until the end, whereas here, it was repeating everything throughout the entire story, and it's not that it was a fiction, but it was just a time loop. And Edward Grove was able to control, like, all the servants and stuff. So I understand that, and the fact that this was only... I don't know, like, if these are, like, based on novels and stuff. I know Damaged Goods was, and technically... I don't think the Holy Terror itself is based on the comics, but, like, it's a continuation from the comics with the 6th Doctor and Frobisher. But in terms of when they were made, this one was made 2 years after the Holy Terror, so it is interesting that it is sort of similar like that.
Yeah.
But still, I did like it.
Alex and I discussed the fact prior to recording that we liked the fact that it was very self-contained. I mean, it was it wasn't like Holy Terror, which went all over London and giant squids and the whole works.
Damaged Goods.
Damaged Goods.
Yeah.
What did I say?
Holy Terror.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
But still.
Yeah. That it was self-contained, short number of characters, very distinct. I mean, you could tell the difference between Mr. Shaughnessy and Frederick, and even the Mrs. Baddeley and Edith and Mary all had very distinct ways of speaking.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like all right, who's speaking now? And I also like the fact that nearly every time somebody new spoke, they mentioned that person's name, like whether it was the Doctor or Charlie, or specifically the servants, Mr. Shaughnessy or Mrs. Baddeley or whoever. That made it very easy to follow for me.
Yeah.
So
yeah, let's see. The first thing I wrote down was don't plot a course, and I'm trying to remember everything that happened. That was one of the first things. Didn't the Doctor say it's like, well, let's just let the TARDIS figure out, which actually is sort of like the Holy Terror as well. It's like, let's just let the TARDIS take us somewhere, and this is just where they ended up. Which it is like the Holy Terror, except in the Holy Terror they had no choice. The TARDIS was just taking them anyway.
And it really does to me anyway, it felt like at the very end, because I kept wondering, why did the TARDIS bring them here? And then I realized it has something to do with Charlie's origin story.
Yes.
So, but that is not clear. I mean, although you begin to realize there's something about Charlie by the end of the second episode, it's still not to the very end when you realize that they were dropped down here specifically because they had to finalize something about Charlie's origin story. Did she or did she not actually die in the crash of the Zeppelin dirigible, whatever it was?
Right. And now it's interesting because, a lot of the times, it is true that a lot of the times the Doctor will plot a specific course, but it is mentioned that the TARDIS will just sort of subvert his orders and just take them where he is needed, basically. Yeah. So even if, which kind of makes sense for the Holy Terror, it's like, okay, well, why did the TARDIS bring us here? It's specifically that, the TARDIS knows that the Doctor is needed here in order for things to get better, basically. So that was interesting. I like the idea that they were outside of time. They were in the same room, but they were just outside of time. Like everything had kind of already happened, and they were just on the outside. That was interesting. And then seeing Edith's name appear in the dust to them, even though to her she had just done it. So that was an interesting concept.
Yeah, there was a very similar original Star Trek series that I thought they were going towards, which was that the Doctor and Charlie were somehow in a different phase, like almost a different dimension, where they were speeded up, and they were hearing the faint echoes of the people who were slowed down, and then they were going to try to break into slowing themselves down so that they could interact with people. But that's not the way it worked out. But it was very reminiscent of that. So it was nice that the raspberry jam broke and then it unbroke, and then there was her name in the dust, and then it wasn't in the dust, and that was again very intriguing, I thought.
Yeah. Let's see. They did reference the Doctor as being from Scotland Yard, which he has used that. He has used that sort of excuse or identity, the Inspector from Scotland Yard, before. I know the 11th Doctor used that. He actually used that on President Nixon when he showed up, and he was like, "Oh, well, you seem to have a real problem. I'm the Inspector from Scotland Yard." So that was interesting.
Also, somewhat, and again, forgive me for rambling, reminiscent of a really good film from the 1980s called Time After Time, and it's a story about how H.G. Wells, the man who wrote The Time Machine, has invented one, and one of his friends turns out to be a man who turns out to be Jack the Ripper.
Right.
And Jack the Ripper steals it and goes back in time. And when H.G. Wells follows him back to San Francisco, he makes the mistake because he says, I'll choose a name that nobody will have ever heard of. He says, oh, yes, there's this little-known fictional detective. So when he's questioned by the police, he says, oh, well, my name is Sherlock Holmes, not realizing, of course, that the huge following that Holmes would have in the 1980s. So
yeah. And I guess the Doctor, even though he didn't use it here, he does sort of have that on lockdown where he just says he's John Smith. So that's the thing. H.G. Wells just needed just a basic name like John Smith. Let's see. And again with the audios, it's like I have to decipher some of my notes, which is different from how we normally react to the episodes. Let's see. Nobody. That was interesting. The constant you are nobody, you are nothing, you are just a servant.
Yeah, I wrote that down too. That's the one thing that really came out of that first episode is they kept repeating, "You're nobody, you're nobody, you're nobody." So I thought, all right, well, that's got to obviously play in somewhere. Yeah. And the fact that they talk about his lordship and her ladyship, but it's so vague that again you begin to wonder, do they actually exist, or is something else going on here?
Well, because they never have a name for them.
Yeah,
it's just their lordship and their ladyship. So yeah, that was interesting. I also wrote down the shifty eyes. I thought that was funny. Everyone has shifty eyes apparently, and that was also one thing. Was the Doctor was incredibly funny in this?
Yeah. Again, a lot of really, I thought, very very subtle humor. That class warfare. I don't want to say class warfare. Class distinctions that they have in Great Britain. The one girl who takes offense at being called a scullery maid because she's she's the lady's maid instead. She's her ladyship's maid. So
Yeah.
Here in the United States, we wouldn't think of that twice. I mean, they're all just servants. But yes, there is a distinction about, well, you're the kitchen maid. You're the one who peels potatoes. I'm the one who actually takes care of her ladyship. So that was kind of
cool. Let's see. Upstairs, that was interesting. It's also nice that we did pretty much just stay downstairs the entire time. There was never a way to go upstairs. Time running away. Trying to remember everything I wrote down. Time running away, that was interesting. I thought the sink plunger was funny. The way she died with the sink plunger.
And I don't know if you heard, but at one point when the doctor said something about, or someone, it may have been Mr. Shaughnessy, but they said, the poor girl, we should remove the plunger from her face. And just in the background you hear this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's horribly grotesque, but very funny at the same time.
Right.
And I will say, and I told you this before, I thought that there was one really, really off-the-wall clue. They kept talking about the grandfather clock, and I thought, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Grandfather clock, last time we heard about the grandfather clock was back when the doctor met the gooey master after he had burned up with Tom Baker or whatever. So I thought, is this going to be another master story? It turns out, no, he's not anywhere in it.
So. That would have been interesting. Now, we should also remember, because anything with the Eighth Doctor has to take place after the movie, because in the movie he regenerated. So technically, last we saw with the Eighth Doctor, the Master is dead. Again. So
again.
Well, because that was the thing, was that
I'm not dead yet.
He lives his life.
You're not fooling anybody.
He lives his life. He gets gooey. He gets executed. He comes back as Eric Roberts, and then he dies again. And then they're going to bring him back again, because we have to bring him back in modern Doctor Who as well. But yeah, that would have been interesting. But as you were saying, because you were saying that his TARDIS was a grandfather clock, but that just so happened to be what his TARDIS was. I mean, the first time we saw him in Terror of the Autons, I think he his TARDIS materialized at a carnival, and it was just a truck,
carnival
basically.
truck. I remember that now.
Yeah. Let's see. I wrote down the plum pudding. That did get a little weird, but I understand that it's supposed to be Edith trying to basically jog Charlie's memories, which was interesting. And every time they said puppet, I just thought of Pirates of the Caribbean.
I did too.
Yeah, just every time it was like, all right, it was a little weird. Let's see.
Yes, I wrote down when Mrs. Badley kept mentioning the pudding, I wrote down she seems to know Charlie's past, but Charlie hasn't been born yet. So I said that's when I began to realize this has got to have something to do with Charlie. We just haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah. Now, I was also trying to think, with them talking about they're basically being incorporated into the story. I was thinking that, with the plum pudding, it was just that they were just going to make her into the new Edith. But that does make sense with trying to basically bring in Charlie's story, which, to be fair, we're at a bit of a disadvantage. We don't know Charlie's story. We don't know how she first met the Doctor, but it did make it interesting. Edward Grove is alive. I wrote that one down. That was also interesting, and just the plot twist that it's the house that is alive.
22 Edward Grove. Yeah, that took me by surprise too. By the way, I loved the. I wrote down anachronisms. I don't know that that's the correct word, but talking about Agatha Christie and then finding out, hey, wait a minute, Agatha Christie hasn't been born yet, and then you've got the Chrysler. No, the Chrysler hasn't been invented yet. Oh, it's the Bentley. It's like, okay, so something really strange is going on here, because they keep referring to things later on in the 20th century, but this is only like Christmas Eve 1906, I think is what we ultimately wrote down. Yeah. So, again, I began to realize there has to be some kind of time loop or time problem going on here. But again, I was thinking maybe the Master is manipulating this. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, so then we go on into episode 3.
Yeah. And I also like, too, with the sort of anachronisms, I drive a Chrysler, and it's like, well, that wasn't invented yet. Oh, no, sorry, I meant a Bentley. And then I think when Mary is crying over Frederick after he dies, and she's like, oh, he was just a good man that drove a Chrysler, or a Bentley, whichever one it was. I thought that was funny.
And I love that, yes, got out of the car and ran over himself, and then let the car go forward, and then went back and put himself down, and then died. It's like, okay, it's now it's beginning to get absurd, so.
because they kept insisting that it was suicide, and eventually the doctor just ran with it. It's like, oh, so isn't it suicide? And he was like, yes, of course it's suicide. He obviously brought the car into the house, ran over himself, put the car back where he was, fell down, and died. That's clearly what happened.
Yes.
and they're just like, okay, you said it, doctor. So that was good, and I just like the fast quips that the doctor had, because we didn't get a ton of that in the movie. So that's nice, sort of fleshing out this doctor. Let's see. I wrote down that I guess it was at the end of episode 3 that they just left. They just up and left in the TARDIS, or tried to leave, basically. I thought that was interesting, that the doctor would be willing to just sort of let this go and just sort of move on with life, basically, because that does seem kind of, I don't know, I guess against, I don't want to necessarily say against the doctor's character, but at least some of the doctors that I have seen, in fact, I just watched an episode of Doctor Who where he says, we never walk away. We always try to figure something out. Yeah. But he was straight up ready to leave. Like, all right, let's get back in the TARDIS and we're out of here. It's just that, they happened to bring the house into the TARDIS that kept them there.
By the way, my favorite line was there in part 3 when Shaughnessy is, I guess, being accused of killing, I don't know, Edith may be gone by this time. Maybe it was Mary, but the Shaughnessy kept saying, "Oh, I couldn't have done it," and the doctor, as he was going upstairs, said something to the effect of, "Well, yes, whoever heard of the butler doing it?" I mean, that's the classic line of all these wonderful old mysteries from the early 20th century. Oh, the butler did it.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you've never seen a wonderful show called What the Butler Saw by Joe Orton, you really need to either read it or see it. I think there's a movie version of it. Oh, it's very kinky, but very funny.
All right, then. Let's see. I also wrote down, with the house sort of incorporating the TARDIS, I wrote down the spatial loop where they still go through the door and they're just in the same room, basically. That was interesting. There was a Doctor Who minisode that kind of did that, where they screwed something up inside the TARDIS, and then when they look over, the box is just inside the TARDIS. So they're just stuck there. You go into the box, you just walk into the TARDIS. So
I wrote down, it's Schrodinger's house. It is both there and not there at the same time. The house is alive, but it is not alive. Yeah, it was getting very confusing by this point.
Yeah. Let's see. Charlie's cook, Edith. That was interesting, and the origin of, Charlie was the only one who was nice to Edith, and when it's like, oh, well, she died, that's what they all just kind of assumed is, oh, well, she died, and then that just caused Edith to lose everything, commit suicide. But I don't know, maybe I'm kind of missing the link there. What was the link between her suicide and eventually the house becoming alive?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Because I didn't get all of that. Again, that was all part of the Schrodinger's house comment that I wrote down.
Yeah.
I wasn't exactly sure how. Maybe it was because they kept talking about how houses can take on not the personality, but certainly the life forces. So maybe it was Edith's original suicide, because Charlie supposedly died outside of the house somewhere else in Europe.
Yeah.
And it's Edith's suicide that somehow catches the house in the time loop, and then every time it replays, it gains more energy, and it becomes sentient and becomes Edward Grove. Again, that wasn't extremely well explained, but then on the other hand, it didn't really matter that it didn't, because
I guess that's
we're
true.
dealing with a temporal and a spatial anomaly here, and it's like where you open the door and you walk through and you're still in the same room, like you just said.
Right.
So I don't know that it's supposed to make sense. So it didn't really. I just kind of let that one go.
That's true, and that does sort of lend a mystery even in here to Charlie's origin, because like we said, we don't know Charlie's origin because we haven't listened to that audio or wherever she first appeared, so we don't know how she and the Doctor first met. What were the circumstances that led to that crash? But I like that this still keeps a mystery that even they don't fully know, or maybe the Doctor does, but he's not saying anything.
Yeah, he did say something at the end where I think Charlie asked him, or someone, maybe the house asked him, how did this all happen? And he basically said, I'll tell you some other time. So
Yeah.
to me, what I was thinking was that somehow or other the TARDIS appearing in that timeline where Charlie was on the airship, perhaps he somehow caused the airship to crash, but then rescued her from the flames, after she had technically died, but maybe he'd gone back, just 30 seconds earlier and pulled her out before that happened. So, it seemed to be some kind of mystery about why he wasn't willing to talk about how they actually met, other than he did get her out of the airship before she died, even though everybody thought she died. So
because that's the other thing, is that when he did save her, it must just be that then he left. Like, why didn't he go back to the house and be like, no, she is alive, or have her go there, maybe get her stuff and then go on these adventures? It just seems like they just immediately left for that, and that could have caused some sort of spatial anomaly, which catapulted with Edith's suicide and allowed for all this stuff with Edward Grove.
There's kind of an interesting parallel, and you've heard your mother and I talk about this frequently. Your mom's been in education for 40 years, and I've been in for 25 years, and you never know what kind of effect you're going to have on a student. Some of the students that you just barely remember, and years later you might meet them and they say, oh, you had such a profound effect on my life. And you always thank them and say, oh, that's really nice of you, and you're going, how on earth did I affect that child? And that's the way that Charlie is with Edith. She goes, I kind of remember Edith. I just remember that I liked her, she was a nice person, but it never occurred to her as a child that Edith was being put down by all the rest of the staff because she was just a scullery maid, and that her just saying, you are somebody, you're not just a nobody, you can make something out of your life, would literally, butterfly effect, change the entire world, because instead of Edith dying, maybe Edith goes on to be somebody great.
Yeah, and that does sort of parallel to the Doctor, because that in many, there are a number of 11th Doctor episodes where they show sort of just the briefest moments that the Doctor has with someone, and then later he sees that did have a profound effect on him, or on them. Like, there was one character who, he went back to as they were dying after this battle, and they were like, oh yeah, I remember when we ran through the forest, and he doesn't remember doing that at all. The man's over 1,000 years old at this point, and he says, yeah, we did run, didn't we? Just remember that. And it does sort of take an effect on him when it does lead to like their deaths, which could take an effect on Charlie too now, with Edith's suicide. So yeah, that is an interesting parallel between both of them too. Let's see.
That even kind of harkens back, and again, you'll forgive my odd science fiction references here. Wrath of Khan. In the original Star Trek series, he says, I feel that even though you tried to take over my ship and kill me, I need to give you a chance to start over again. So he puts Khan and his people on the planet, but doesn't go back and doesn't understand what has happened to them, so that when he does randomly run into them 15 years later, it literally changes the universe, because they blow up a planet and recreate a new planet. It's like, all because you forgot to check in on this guy. Wow.
Yeah. Which even, just before we filmed this, I was filming something else, and it was sort of the same thing where there was a character that left one of their friends behind. It was just like, just because they were just getting tired of their friend and they wanted to move on, and they just said, just stay here. I'll be back someday. And then they just never came back. And this, in the show, it was like 6,000 years later, all that sort of sci-fi cartoon stuff. And that did have an effect on that person. They were waiting there for so long that it just drove them insane. So it is somewhat like that. You have to think about stuff. And I wrote that down. I just wrote down positive reinforcement. There was a little bit of positive reinforcement there. I think I'm somewhat forgetting the ending. Did they save Edith at the end? Okay.
Because I wrote down, the doctor realizes that Shaughnessy has to kill him so that he can go in and talk to Charlie and Edith. And then I wrote down, talks Charlie out of dying, and Edith doesn't die because of that.
Right. And then she did start to get a little like, no, I am somebody. Yeah, and that's all right. I was just making sure. I listened to this yesterday, and I already forgot. So,
it's again. I know that in the comments, a lot of people say they love the audios, the audio dramas, and that's fine. It's just it doesn't appeal to me as much as the visual.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. It just has to be done. It has to be done right. Like this one was good, nice and contained. Even the Holy Terror, to an extent, was pretty contained. It just had a few extra characters. And Damaged Goods was the one where it's like, this is a little too much. And I even said to you that it's not even that they were trying to make a classic episode. They made a modern episode and then tried to put that to a classic Doctor in an audio, which was not the correct format for it. But this one worked. I can definitely see this and like the Holy Terror as classic episodes. Yeah. So, and then I guess the last thing I wrote down was we do have the mystery of it technically is Charlie dead or alive, and what happened with how she met the Doctor. It would actually be interesting too if maybe in the audios technically they don't really tell because it's audio. Like they don't really explain their origins. Like maybe that's just its own story that they don't tell. They just start with, oh, here's the Eighth Doctor with his new companion. All right, and there they go. And that leads into the mystery of later we will tell you what happened. But that would require listening to the rest of the audios, which this is our last sort of, I guess, our tour through Classic Who before we just go back to the beginning and go chronologically. And so with this being the Eighth Doctor, maybe a while if we're going in order.
Yeah.
Oh man, it's
well when you think there's, I mean, I know it's 6 years now, but there was that gap in between. But even so, I mean, even if we watched an episode, not an entire series or serial, but an episode a day, that would take us literally years to get through that. So don't know that I'm going to last that long.
I was gonna say, it's like if we go, because right now the way we have it is we're not gonna, when we start up on the serials again, we're not gonna do the whole let's watch 7 episodes in one sitting. We're not doing that anymore. I think the most we have is like 4, which those aren't too bad. It just takes a few hours. So if we go by that, it is definitely going to take years going that way. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, and I hate to say it, you're not that young anymore.
No, I'm not.
You will, if we go through all this and you stick with me, you're definitely going to be over 70 by the time we're done.
Yes. So.
But I don't know. We'll at least keep going either way. Even if you tap out for a while, I'll just keep going for forever.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to say here at the end. Now, if you'd rather I not mention the big milestones that we both had on Friday, I mean, I can tell mine if you don't want me to say yours, but yes, Alex was just mentioning, I'm actually much older. In fact, I just turned 68 on Friday.
Yeah.
So this week, when he says I'll be 70 before this is all over, he's not kidding.
Unless we wrap this up in 2 years. No, I think we would have to like watch one Doctor like every 3 months, and that's not happening.
And
So
I'm still teaching, so I still have homework and lesson plans and all that stuff to do.
yeah, but I mean we'll try.
We'll do our best.
We'll go as long as we can. The only issue I can see is the fact that, let's be honest, the show's not going to end. Especially for me, the new modern stuff, I will keep watching even if you're not in those reactions. But I mean, the only way to get out of these classic videos is for one of two things to happen: is for all the classic Doctors to die, or for you to die. So
let's not go there.
Yeah, it'll be a while. It will definitely be a while. But in order to stop sort of thinking about that, next week we're back to reactions.
Yay!
Yeah. Next week we will be moving on to the 2003 animated special Scream of the Shalka, which will have the alternative Ninth Doctor before the official Ninth Doctor with Christopher Eccleston. This will have, I believe it's Richard E. Grant as...
Why does that name sound familiar?
I'm not sure. He's popped up a few times on modern Doctor Who, but I'm not sure who he would have played.
I bet I would recognize
him. But he will be the voice of our alternative Ninth Doctor, and then after that we'll get into the real Ninth Doctor.
Okay, when do we get to the 50th anniversary? Is that sometime soon?
February.
Okay.
It will be February, and that's mostly because ignore all this. Is because this is where I am right now.
Yeah.
I just watched The Rings of Akaten, and I have to go through the rest of Doctor Who Series 7 and then get to the 50th anniversary myself. And then you'll get to the 50th anniversary. And then we watch some spoofs and...
Oh, cool.
Watch some spoofs. I think there's one with Rowan Atkinson.
I love Rowan Atkinson.
Yeah.
Now, again, long before I ever saw Mr. Bean, I was a fan of Blackadder. And again, now I'm sure most of our fans here have seen Blackadder. If you haven't, you must. Especially, again, if you're history geeks like we are. Because it starts out in one era. I think it's like the Middle Ages, but then it goes to like a Renaissance, and then to an Age of Enlightenment, and then up to World War I. Just each time it's literally the same characters, but just in a new setting, and they are just absolutely historical and hysterical at the same time. So if you have not seen Blackadder 1 through 3 and 4, please stop and go see those.
Yeah, and I think it's Rowan Atkinson who's going to be playing the spoof Doctor for an episode. So we will get around to that, but that will be 2020. So that'll be 2020. In the meantime, we've got 2 things left for 2019. Scream of the Shalka with Richard E. Grant as the alternative Ninth Doctor, and we will... technically, our classic reactions will go on hold for a bit as we do modern reactions, and we go through Series 1, Episode 6, Dalek with Christopher Eccleston. But that's later.
Okay, so now, I'm just... Your thing here, when you say Series 1, that's Series 1 from the reboot?
Yes.
Okay, so...
The way they distinguish it is that for the modern episodes, they say series instead of season. And then for the classics, they use season instead of series. So, yeah, it's very confusing. I've had people go into arguments in the comments when I tried to understand it. But basically, yes, it is modern Season 1, Episode 6.
Now, when did Eccleston take over? When's the reboot? Is that like 2003 or something?
2005.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and when was the last... of the Doctors in the classics? When did it go off? Like
the 7th Doctor ended in the mid to late 80s.
Okay.
And then the 8th Doctor's movie was 96, I think.
Okay.
So
okay, so there's a considerable gap in there.
Yes, okay. which they go ahead and explain in the show as well. The Doctor was in a war. He's busy. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it. again, back to the Chimes of Midnight. Overall, I did like this. This was good. And yeah, that is pretty much that. If you got anything else?
I'm good.
All right. So with all that being said, we're Alex and Dad from 7th Hour Films, and we will see you guys next time. Take care. Alright guys, thanks for watching this video. If you want to watch more of our Doctor Who classic videos, you can click on the playlist, you can subscribe if you haven't done that already, and be sure you hit that notification bell. You can support me on Patreon and follow me on social media, links below in the description. See you guys later.